Good morning, people. Right, okay. I said to you before the Easter holidays, we're going to just focus on chapter 26 across this week. It's a long chapter. It won't take us massive amount of time to do it, but just because it is such a long chapter, I just wanted to kind of have it stand alone, and then we deal with the last bits all together. Now, there are two main things I want to do today, and then one main kind of focus for it tomorrow. The main bits I want to look at today are the use of vignettes at the start of the chapter. So we need to look up what a vignette is. We need to kind of identify the vignettes overall at the start of this chapter, and then look at kind of specific sections that go with them. And then the other bit that we want to look at today is the way in which the setting of the farm overall is depicted, the farm that they move on to in terms of finding work, and kind of consider that in kind of relation back to the weed patch camp as well. So first thing you need to do, pause it for a moment. You need to go and find out what a vignette is. Ideally find somewhere that gives you examples that goes alongside it. They are a literary technique, but you'll also find it used in film and things as well. So go away and see if you can find a definition that goes with it. Okay, so with a vignette, basically it's a kind of a far shorter little incident that happens within a narrative. It's not necessarily developed in the same detail. It's these little bits put together. So if you look at kind of definition, short descriptive literary sketch, or a brief incident or scene, as in a kind of a play or a movie, is sort of short, kind of with a purpose to it still. And if you look at the start of chapter 26, there are kind of these, it moves very quickly between these kind of little scenes as the Jodes are kind of preparing to leave the camp. And each of these could be described as a vignette. The first one is possibly a bit longer than a vignette would normally be, but the later ones that I'm going to give you on the sheet are definitely what we would describe as a vignette. So what you're going to need here is the sheet that I've attached to the email, and along that sheet you should find that there are kind of 6 little extracts from the slightly longer vignettes that go in the chapter. Now the first one is the longer one, possibly not technically a vignette in quite the same way as the other ones, with Mar kind of leading the decision to leave the camp. The second one moves into a more direct vignette. You get it with Rose's kind of the ear piercing. Then we get Al's kind of leave taking of the girl he's with, Pa and Uncle John bidding goodbye to the manager, Tom saying goodbye, and then the reference to kind of Winfield's fight. So I've given you kind of the brief outline of that, and I've given you a little kind of extract from the text. Now, what you need to do, don't just look at the extract on the sheet. You need to consider these within the context of what's happening in slightly larger vignettes as well. So you do need the book alongside rather than just the sheet necessarily. But I think the bits that I've picked out are probably the best bits of evidence to allow you to discuss those uses of vignette and why they're important in relation to the narrative, what they kind of show going on within the narrative. But don't just look at them on the sheet. Make sure you've got the book to build up that context around them. Now, the aim here, and I'd say it's probably going to take kind of maybe 15-20 minutes to do it properly. You want to look at the vignette overall, look at the little bit of extract on the sheet, and think, what's the point that Steinbeck's trying to make here? In the first couple, it's going to be around kind of gender roles, the development of the female characters. In the later ones, it's more kind of wider in terms of the kind of social context and things. So think what the point actually is. Even with the bits I've given on the sheet, they're going to be too long to quote end to end in the exam and remember end to end. So you would have to kind of pick out bits from them. So consider which bits you would actually be picking from those longer sections as well in order to actually explain around them. Okay, so I want you to pause me for about kind of 15-20 minutes where you have a go at doing it yourself. Then I'll kind of talk through the key points afterwards. Okay. Okay, so with that first kind of vignette, we've talked before about this move across the novel from this form of kind of patriarchy to a matriarchy. And we've talked about kind of it's hinted at the start of the novel, how it grows more overt as the novel goes through with Mar's kind of seizing of the jack handle. And now we're at a stage where this seizing of power is completely overt, and it's even kind of directly referenced by Parr. So seems like times have changed, said sarcastically. Time was when a man said we do. Seems like women is telling now. Seems like it's pretty near time to get out of stick. So whilst Parr does kind of threaten reprisal here with the reference to kind of getting out of stick, there is a sense of kind of Mar has made the decision. Times have changed. Women is telling now. So it's all about Mar kind of seizing the authority and the power within the situation. She is depicted as the one in control as the Joad family moves forward. Now, the second of these links into kind of Rose of Sharon, and it's an important kind of moment for Rose. She's very close to giving birth, and she has changed across the narrative. So whereas at the start there's a kind of naivety to her, there's this complete self-assurance and kind of naivety to the realities of the world, she is depicted as kind of growing across the narrative, and she's not to quite the same level as Mar at this point, but remember, she is going to develop to that point of strength as the narrative goes onwards with that kind of final closing image of the narrative. So here, this brief vignette of the ear piercing becomes important. It's a kind of rite of passage for Rose into womanhood. So it shows her kind of growing up. And it's also the kind of the way that she's depicted as kind of approaching it. There's a kind of strength to this in terms of its transition. Rose of Sharon touched her ears tenderly and looked at the tiny spots of blood. So there is a change here. Blood as this kind of symbol of transition as well. It didn't hurt, just stuck a little. So that kind of approach to it suggests a kind of something stronger growing in Rose that hasn't necessarily been there before. Okay, then we get the image of kind of Al and his leaving of this girl he's just started a kind of relationship with. Now, this is an interesting one because Steinbeck creates a kind of romanticism around the image. The kind of Al bent over her and he saw the bright evening star reflected in her eyes. So there is something kind of potentially positive about the image, the idea of coming together, the idea of potentially this kind of support that a relationship might offer him. But you also get the image here, and he saw the black cloud reflected in her eyes, and any kind of extended relationship with this girl potentially poses problems and risks for Al as well. Remember, he's only 16 years old in the context of the narrative. So to take this further would create a kind of, I'm trying to think how to phrase this, a weight essentially upon him. It would create a person of reliance upon him. And given the kind of wider context, the Dust Bowl, the migration crisis, it would actually kind of make his life far more difficult at the same time. So within this vignette, we get the kind of conflicted image of this girl. She's both a figure that he looks towards and as a figure of support, but also a figure that can potentially drag him down. Now, the Pa and Uncle John bidding goodbye to the manager one, that's important because once again we return to that image of kind of cleanliness that Steinbeck has been building up in previous chapters. Funny thing, used to be I only got a bath every week and I never seemed to stink, but now if I don't get one every day I stink. Wonder if taking a bath so often makes that. And one of the things that Steinbeck's kind of explored is the way that the Oklahomans have been kind of purposefully denied their kind of humanity. They've had these things taken away from them as what was essentially to kind of facilitate the exploitation that they're suffering. So by drawing our attention back to this kind of cleanliness, the expectation of it, the desire to be clean, he shows that kind of humanity returning, and it's going to stand in kind of stark contrast as they move forward. Within the Tom one, again, this brief vignette, and it draws our attention back to the power of the kind of collective action that Steinbeck kind of advocates so strongly. And he talks here about Deputy can't pick on one fella in this camp, he's picking on the whole damn camp and he don't dare. So essentially what Steinbeck is doing is he's showing the power of this kind of unity coming through here. He's demonstrating the way in which when they work together and as a group, they are safer, essentially. The last of these little kind of vignettes is the one that kind of reflects on the younger children. And what it shows here is that even within the migrant communities, there's a kind of conflict going on. So hang on a second. Okay, so within that kind of final one of the vignettes, that conflict that Winfred and this child from Oregon have had, it's about showing how very often in these kind of places of crisis, the blame is placed in the wrong places, the conflict and kind of anger is directed at the wrong groups. So it's important that this fight is kind of done with the children because it shows that this whole conception is a childish conception. It's wrong, essentially. And it shows that this kind of misdirected. They're fighting amongst themselves, these migrant communities, when it should be directed at those at the top, those doing the exploitation. So Steinbeck is essentially showing the kind of fallacy of this. He's showing and sort of demonstrating that it's counterproductive. Right. So next thing we want to look at within this, you're going to use page 384 to 387, and if I give you 2 seconds, hang on. Right, so if people are using the yellow book, then it's the bit that starts with, okay, wait here a minute, he moved to the side of the road, and I'm kind of going to focus on the bit onto 387. He made a little crank of the shortest piece and turned it around and around in his hands. So just a couple of pages there, and it is probably around about halfway through the chapter. Remember, it's a very long chapter, this one. That's one side of it. No, probably not quite halfway through. Closer to probably just closer to a third if you're looking for it in the yellow books. Right, Now, within this, you've got the Jodes who, running out of money, have been forced to leave the weed patch camp despite its comforts, and travel north to try and find work on a farm. And Steinbeck creates a kind of very disturbing scene here. It's something quite kind of frightening in relation to what's happening, because as they move into this farm, it's essentially it's akin to a prison over at the kind of place of growth. So farm we associate with growth, and yet this is more like a kind of prison. It's very kind of disturbing and damaging. It's got a kind of militaristic air to it. And he draws our attention to various different things, to kind of controlled entries into the setting, the hostility and the potential violence that kind of surrounds the whole of the setting. And he draws our attention, he creates a sense of irony that surrounds this as well. All of this kind of protection around the farm that makes it seem prison-like is not to keep people in, but to keep the kind of communists out, and to stop the workers mixing with the strikers and kind of realizing what's going on. Yeah, so he's creating kind of sense of irony around this. They're spending money and resources in guarding this place rather than simply paying a good wage. So in terms of his kind of his contextual point, his intentions here, it's all about kind of doing that. And you need to kind of think about this setting as a kind of point of contrast back to the weed patch camp as well. So by talking about different settings and how they're used to contrast each other, you're going to make kind of stronger points here. So what I want you to do, I want you to use that section of the narrative, just a simple kind of close analysis of it here, essentially. Go through it. What kind of images have you got here that kind of highlight the irony, that show the violence, that show the different atmosphere, that show it kind of in contrast to the weed patch camp, and kind of subverting our expectations of what a kind of a farm essentially should be. Okay, I would expect you to spend kind of 15-20 minutes kind of working back through that extract and picking out the kind of small bits, that you would talk about, and then I'll kind of talk through some of the bits that I would pick out afterwards. Okay, so various bits that you want to know kind of coming through this section. So right at the start, they're referred to as a batch. Better take this batch through. So the Jodes themselves aren't necessarily seen as individuals, as people. They've become a commodity within this farm already. They're a batch. They're a product to be moved, and it keeps drawing our attention to who it is again that's leading them through. These are police officers. They are, again, working in collusion with business. We've looked at this before, the way that Steinbeck is showing the kind of out of place nature of this. Police are not there to work for business interests. Police are there to protect people, and yet he's showing them in this position again and again. So it's the patrolman. Don't need 4 cops to let us. So, you know, they're using the police force, but in a sort of unacceptable way. As it kind of continues through, we get the reference to the strikers outside, but you get this image here, of a kind of conscious attempt to silence this protest. So the motorcycles roared their motors. Tom saw a line of men standing in the ditch beside the road, saw their mouths open as though they were yelling, saw their shaking fists and their furious faces. A stout woman ran towards the cars, but a roaring motorcycle stood in her way. So whilst kind of there's an awareness of the anger and the frustration. There's a drowning out of the voice, kind of symbolically here. There's a deliberate attempt to kind of cover it over as Steinbeck's implication, and the police officers are kind of at one with this as well. And you keep getting these kind of references to weapons coming through. So each one carried a shotgun. There's something excessive about this. And the dialogue that runs all the way through it as well helps to kind of shape this image too. So, what the hell are you waiting for? This kind of question, this hostility that hasn't been there in the weed patch camp. And it kind of continues. At the end of each row of square houses stood two men armed with shotguns and wearing big silver stars pinned to their shirts. So again, these are sheriff's deputies, and again, we'd get our attention drawn to the kind of potential for excess violence, this overt hostility and violence that surrounds the Joad family now. And again, as we kind of work through it, the dialogue continues in this fashion. It's purely functional. So as opposed to the weed patch camp, where you get the kind of the help of the manager, the kind of community element, the discussion element, we return to this purely functional dialogue. How many men can all of you work? Go to work right away. So this kind of imperative, forceful nature. There's no consensual element to it. It's imposed. The return again, the deputies come in, two deputies approached. Their position commanded the length of the street. The other big bit to kind of mention here is, again, you're thinking about the contrast, the weed patch camp, Steinbeck's image of kind of cleanliness, of cleaning, all coming back into this again here. The floor was splashed with grease. In one room stood a rusty tin stove and nothing more. The room smelled of sweat and grease. And again, as opposed to the government camps, these places that return humanity to the people, this place is depicted as another one of those areas that seeks to take that away from them, okay, to kind of remove them from that. And Steinbeck depicts the way that this kind of reflects onto the family, the way that this kind of closes them down, and not just the family. He shows it as kind of reflecting into the wider atmosphere. So as we look towards the end of the section, the men unloaded silently. A fear had fallen onto them. So this kind of use of metaphor showing this kind of oppressive atmosphere. And this passes on to the children as well. So remember back at the weed patch camp where Steinbeck has them kind of running off on their own, exploring the kind of toilet blocks and things like this. Here, the pall had fallen on Ruthie and Winfield. They did not dash away to inspect the place. So again, there's that similarity in terms of how they're depicted here as well. The metaphor kind of crushing them down too. And you get the reference to the woman who walks by as well, which again is reflective of the differences between these two camp settings that Steinbeck wants us to see. A woman went by in the street, but she did not look at them. Her head was sunk and her dirty gingham dress was frayed at the bottom in little flags. So again, this woman, as opposed to the cleanliness of the weed patch camp, she's depicted as dirty, as broken down. This camp is kind of a conscious attempt to break people down again in order to exploit them for their kind of potential work. So that's the bit that I want to look at today directly. This is the point where if we were in college, there's a documentary I would have shown you as well. Okay, so it kind of shows this situation. It shows the Californian bit. It allows a kind of recall back at it. So what I would recommend you do, if you go onto YouTube, it's open access. If you search for John Steinbeck, Voice of America, it's a good documentary. It actually shows you kind of video images of these camps at the time period. And I think it gives you a kind of a good recall of the earlier sections of the journey, but really gets you to see what is happening within the camps and Steinbeck's intention around that at this point in the novel. So make that the other thing that you do at this stage, okay? And then we'll look tomorrow at the religious elements kind of surrounding Casey, okay? Toodaloo for now, people.